A very good morning to all of you, and those tuning in from Australia, a very good afternoon. And we're very pleased that you've been able to join us today in the next episode of the Bridge Project's New Age Diplomacy and Development series, where we unpack opportunities and challenges in the realm of subnational diplomacy and development. And today we are very pleased to have with us two distinguished guests, Mr. Dipen Rughani and Natasha Jha Bhaskar. A brief introduction to both of them before we kind of get to the crux of the podcast. Now, Dipen has led the Newland Global Group since 2010 as its CEO. He works closely with all the state governments of Australia, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Austrade, Indian consulates, and the Indian High Commission in Canberra. Dipen has also led the Australia-India Business Council as its national chairman from 2012 to 2016 and played a pivotal role in leading Australian delegations to Vibrant Gujarat, one of India's largest state investment summits. He also made significant contributions to the Australian government's white papers and strategy papers about trade and investment with India, including the Australian Economic Strategy Report, on which we will come to during the course of the conversation. We're also very pleased to have with us Natasha Jha Bhaskar, who is a general manager with the Newland Global Group, with 12 years of exposure to the Indian legislative process in policy analysis and communication with the Indian Parliament. Natasha has participated in numerous national and international conferences as a delegate of the Indian Parliament, like SAARC, ASEAN, BRICS, and the National Legislators Conference. She's also previously been awarded by the United Nations Population Fund, and Natasha regularly writes on issues ranging from policy reform to key sectors of engagement between India and Australia for publications like the Business Today, Lois Interpreter, among others. So, Dipen, Natasha, many thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much, Carl. Thanks for inviting.
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm very delighted to have both of you with us and increasingly looking forward to a very engaging conversation. So maybe we can start off by maybe if the two of you can just give a sense of how the last 1.5 years has been for you, the COVID lockdown. And Dipen did briefly mention this before we had gone live. So could you tell us what's life been like, in the lockdown phase in Australia? So we can start with you, Dipen.
Yeah, Carl, it's quite interesting. We did talk about this earlier. Where we are, both Natasha and I, is Sydney, Australia. At the beginning of the COVID situation, which was around March 2020, we had both returned from India after quite a long trip. Didn't think much of it then because we had quite an extensive trip and we had quite a big journey in India. But when we returned, and the first few weeks was quite harrowing because we didn't know what was happening. The whole world didn't know what was happening. But as we evolved through this whole journey, what's happened is that we've learned new ways to communicate. Whereas before we were actually going to places, and as I said earlier, if we were going to hold an event or talk to somebody, we actually had to go to India to take a camera crew or to take an engineering crew with us and so on. Today we can get on a Zoom call or a Microsoft Meet call and have some of the best brains and some of the best sort of stakeholders, senior stakeholders between Australia and India right at your fingertips. So that's been a positive. I guess the negative part of this is we in Sydney for now have been locked down for 8 weeks. I don't believe that there'll be any sort of release on that from the government at the moment because the cases in Sydney seem to keep going up and up and up purely because of the Delta virus, which is very, very contagious, and it doesn't discriminate against old or young. But having said that, we're quite lucky because we've got a beautiful city to live in. We can go out and exercise. And of course, we can have conversations with the likes of yourselves here on a regular basis. So it's been, from a personal basis, it's been a pretty scary at first, adapting in the middle, and now just wondering when we're going to all be able to get out and get back to the new world order.
Natasha?
Thanks, Carl. And I think that's a very pertinent question, because one thing which has stayed in the last 1.5 years, or maybe if I say 2 years, is the fact that we have learned to live in the new normal. And how do we identify and how do we really, in a way, adjust ourselves to this new reality is actually very challenging, both from the professional front or at personal front. As Dipen mentioned, that we are under lockdown. I'm mother of a 9-year-old daughter, and so I'm also part-time educator now. So it's a new role which I'm playing, with all the online learning that's happening. And thankfully, what's strange is that we were very safe for the last 15 months. It's just that, in the last few months, cases have picked up. So I would say the lines between work and life has blurred to quite an extent, because most of the time we just don't know when the office hours have ended. We just like all the time doing things and trying to connect and trying to be more productive, trying to maintain mental sanity, which in closed doors can be very challenging. On a professional front, I would really want to share this. Last year has been very exciting for us. Also because we were reached out to host the India Global Week, which is which was actually it is actually a project of India Inc. based out of London, and this was a very very important event because. As a key partner, as in-country partner for India Global Week, we led 6 to 7 sessions across different sectors, which are of key interest between Australia and India. We had also a presentation by the Trade Minister, also very senior dignitaries, the High Commissioner Peter Vergis, who has authored the India Economic Strategy Report, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, and these streams were very important, and we got a very good traction. The fact that Prime Minister Narendra Modi had inaugurated this event, and it really took the relationship to a new level, I would say. Reason being also because Foreign Minister Jaishankar, Dr. Jaishankar actually talked about Australia in his concluding remarks. About how Australia is going to play a very, very crucial role in building the bilateral ties. So for us, we thought that this was a great event that happened last year, and we are looking forward to the next one, organizing the next one end of this year. So we just try to maintain the personal and the professional front, in spite or despite of COVID, I would say.
Right. No, and I completely agree. I think the Newland Global Group is doing some very interesting work, very exciting work for both India and Australia going forward. And if I could also just briefly ask the two of you, uh, your career journey, your influences, and what eventually led you to the Australian shores, right? So if you could just briefly tell us, what kind of, what all had you gone through in your career journey, and what eventually brought you to Australia, and in the particular business that you're engaged in. We can start with you, Natasha.
See, I would say, Carl, it's interesting because this question is very close to my heart. Reason being that I'm only 3 years old in Sydney, Australia, and because you've asked about my career journey, I would actually go a little back and would like to talk about what has really impacted me in a way. First, of course, this whole desire to grow better and to achieve better. So my aspirations, I would say, and the reason I say that is in year 2002, when I moved to Delhi after finishing school. From Delhi Public School, Mathura Refinery, I was just like any other young student who was lost, confused, and wanted to do too many things. So I had no idea what I wanted from my life, except the fact that I knew I was hardworking. I am hardworking and sincere enough to make things happen. So I started at Lady Shri Ram College and then went on to do my master's from Mass Communication Research Center, Jamia Millia Islamia. Later had an opportunity to do be a Commonwealth scholar as an Indian Parliament representative and pursue masters in public policy. So my educational journey, I would say, has been a very, very, in a way, a big turning point in my life, in my career, helping me go through the process of becoming myself, to know what exactly is important to me, and clear my otherwise young, muddled head. So LSR, I would say, was the perfect platform, instilling in us since day one that, no matter wherever you are, you need to remember it's leadership with social responsibility, and that's what LSR stands for. Uh, Second, my professional journey of 12 years, or at the Indian Parliament, and working in the edifice of Indian democracy, has really helped me feel the pulse of the nation. The pain of the marginalized, the blocks in the system, the compulsions of the elected, and the gaps between the electors and the elected. How do you explore all of this through your work? So, policy research, analysis, engaging with think tanks, ministries, experience working with members of parliament. And it might sound very frivolous, Carl, because it was very tough, because I started very early. I was only 21 when I joined the parliament, so it was very difficult to remember the names of all the constituencies, names of members parliament, different rules, nature of discussions, stay aware and updated about political, social, and economic issues. We were trained by Bureau of Parliamentary Studies and Training, and I remember a large part of my professional life at the parliament, I would reach parliament at 7 a.m. in the morning and have access to the reference and research wing, sit there for hours and hours to make sense of legislative bills, issues. I'm also very grateful to the senior most people who mentored and guided me on this journey, asking me to remember that the biggest ammunition in your work life is knowing everything about your work and knowing it the best, and striving for excellence, be extremely singularly focused. So these have been, this actually left a very, very significant impact on, I would say, how I actually arrived in Australia, and thinking about life and the experiences from a very grassroots perspective, the profoundness of experience and impactfulness of your activity. And that has been a key learning working at the parliament, and also, be aware, be thick-skinned, be a good listener, something which is very, very important. And then in mid 2018, when I arrived in Australia, starting an almost fresh chapter. So, imagine after 12 years, you've been doing this policy making or policy analysis, and suddenly you arrive into a country where you don't know whether you'll be at all useful or not. Reason I say that policy making is very domestic focused. So. What I did know was that I want to do something in the Australia-India space. And thankfully, as luck would have it, this was also the time when the India Economic Strategy 2035 was launched, and Australia's India ties were just picking up. And so I entered this new space of consulting with Newland Global Group, which is singularly focused on simplifying and strengthening trade and investment between both countries. And I hear, I had an opportunity to bring what I have learned in the last several years of problem solving across different, sectoral experience, and utilize that in navigating the Australia-India growth story. Building that capabilities, connections, insights, that how Australian businesses can understand the new India and the growth story better. I'm sorry, because I generally get very carried away when these kind of questions are asked. So I might have taken a lot of time than I should have.
No, I think this is something which we encourage our guests to kind of open up about, because I think what we realized was that the pandemic has just made us reflect on our past, a lot more than we normally would have. So I think this is like very welcome, and I'm sure the young listeners would be very encouraged to look into the space of consulting going forward. Deepan, if I can maybe turn to you now. So you've actually done quite a bit in the business realm. You've hosted business delegations from both India, Australia. You were part of many of the official business events, in fact even organizing Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Australia in November 2014, where you took care of the business side of things. So could you maybe give us a sense of how you navigated the space of India-Australia relations through your professional journey? I'm sure this was not something which people looked with as much excitement as they do today. So how has that journey been like for you, kind of navigating this space?
So thanks, Carl. Look, my journey is very different to Natasha's. I was brought up in London. In fact, I was born in Uganda in East Africa. And at the age of 2, we moved to India, and we lived in India for 5 years in a town called Madhupur, which is near Porbandar in Gujarat. And then at the age of 7, moved to London. So most of my memories are, of course, in London. I didn't really go on to university. I studied up until O levels in the UK. I was very much into sports. So I participated in sports. I played cricket at a competitive level for North London, and I got trials for Middlesex and trained at Lord's a couple of times. And I also played badminton. So I was very, very competitive in the badminton sort of sports arena, and I won the junior Middlesex championships at under 14, under 15, under 16, under 17, under 18 levels, and I won singles, doubles, and mixed. So very competitive. I was trialing for England at that time as well. But then, unfortunately, or fortunately, should I say, I met an Australian girl in London and decided to move out to Australia at the age of 21, which again was very young, being a Gujarati boy, living with mum and dad, not doing much, being looked after, cooking, cleaning, washing, the whole lot. And I just went out and played badminton and had a roof over my head. So it was a different experience for me coming to Australia. And, I worked a little bit in London in retail, but mainly sports, and I was being paid to play sports. I was being sponsored for my equipment and my clothing, and also to play tournaments and so on. Having arrived in Australia, I had to get straight into work, obviously, because there was no sponsorships. I did end up playing for New South Wales, representing New South Wales in badminton. Went on to a couple of national tournaments and made it to the finals of the Australian Championships in 2009, 2010, 1989, 1990 is when I made it to the championships. Thereafter, obviously, badminton wasn't going to be a way of earning a living. I did do some coaching and so on, but I went into work. I put myself into work. So the discipline that was instilled into me when playing badminton, whether it was waking up really early, going for a run, playing, training on the court, training your shots, your court work, your fitness, your food, your intake. It takes a lot of discipline. You have to calculate everything. So that discipline was already instilled into me, so I took that into business. Through that time, obviously, it was very much retail. I worked myself into sales and marketing and business development, and I was headhunted for a number of jobs there. I then started to get into my own business. I worked in software, I've worked in transportation, I've worked in stationery, and so on. Eventually, I started to look at my own businesses, and I decided to educate myself on real estate. So I started to do a lot of real estate work in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, and that led me onto the path of real estate development, property development. I was working in a number of areas, and one was my passion for India. And so I organized an event around 2008, 2009 on real estate with India. So I had got some of the largest real estate agencies like Knight Frank and CBRE and those guys to work with me. We looked at some of the architects and the engineers that were already, Australian architects and engineers that were already operating and assisting Indian real estate projects. We brought them on board, and we had a really nice event. This was part and parcel of a conference that I had put on called the Property Development Investment, and it was a 2-day conference. So on the first evening, so this event was held at the exhibition centre at Darling Harbour. So it's quite a large event. Because we had booked the halls out, they allowed us to have a session in the evening, which is where I held this event. At this time, I was looking for some partners, and I found the Australia-India Business Council. I invited them in, and I suggested that we would do this event under the AIBC. very successful event. Within 6 months of doing that, the AIBC New South Wales management team had asked me to join their committee. And then 6 months later, I was voted in as the president of AIBC New South Wales. Again, my nature was very much about doing, more of action rather than speaking. So we introduced, 12 different industry sectors. We wrote a business strategy called The Way Forward. We looked at the strategic sectors that were, prevalent at that time between Australia and India. We had the state government involved. We had all the major senior stakeholders involved. It wasn't easy putting these chapters together because you had to find experts within that specific industry sector, and then you had to find a committee to run those chapters, and then you obviously had to have some governance behind those. So it took a long time to get that, but it happened. Within that time, AIBC, the whole Australia-India relationship was climbing. AIBC was the peak body, still is the peak body nationally in Australia for trade and investment between the two countries. And we had unincorporated chapters in each state. And so what we decided to do as a committee, as a board, because we used to meet on a regular basis, was to become one entity, AIBC Limited. And so we went on that journey. At the end of 2011, we finished that journey, and then we, as an AIBC Limited organization, I was then voted in as the inaugural chair of AIBC Limited in 2012. Again, as a membership organization, we had to go through quite a bit of adjustment and change in regards to being a company limited by guarantee, reporting to ASIC, which is similar to SEBI in India, and doing the right thing. So we developed a constitution. Obviously, that was already developed when we became a company limited by guarantee, but we utilized that constitution to develop a policy and procedure manual, which would then look at the day-to-day running of the organization, which is still being used to today. We've had some memorable occasions. Obviously, you mentioned one in 2014, of course. Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister. Tony Abbott went to India with an official visit with a business delegation, which I was invited to as the chair of AIBC. And then a visit by Narendra Modi in November 2014, which was, I guess, basically he attended the G20. And then from there was a 3 or 4 day official visit, which was the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister in 28 years. Mind you, the 1986 visit by Rajiv Modi, and Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister then, this is when AIBC was established. So it was fortuitous that, we hosted Narendra Modi. I was asked to organize business events. We organized in Melbourne a CEO roundtable in association with the AIA, the Australia-India Institute, AII. And after the CEO, we had 40 of Australia's largest companies represented there. After the CEO's event, we went into the ballroom, and there were 550 business leaders that got to meet and listen to Narendra Modi, after which Tony Abbott had hosted a dinner for Narendra Modi at the MCG. The day before, Narendra Modi made a historic speech at Parliament House, which was the first ever by an Indian Prime Minister. And I was lucky to be invited by Tony Abbott to sit on the parliamentary floor as a citizen with all the parliamentarians, which was, for me, was an absolutely amazing experience to be there on such a historic occasion. I'm not sure whether I've answered your question about the business side, but it comes from the discipline that was instilled in me before as a sportsman, and I still carried that with me. And India has always been a passion for me. And as I have naturally moved towards the Australia-India business, trade and investment space, I've made it a point to be a lot more active and action orientated as opposed to just speaking and doing nothing about it. Luckily for me, Natasha came on the scene, and she had some really good, deep insights into India, the government, the federal government, how they write policy, how they implement policy at a federal level and at a state level, which was, absolutely valuable to everything that we do. And for me, it was just like, wow, this is great. This is the kind of knowledge that we need in Australia. And we decided to change the narrative between India and Australia through Newland Global Group. We introduced the Australia-India conversations. We introduced, through COVID, the Australia-India webinars. We decided that, yes, the India economic strategy was had highlighted 10 sectors and 10 states. We felt that we wanted to even go a little bit deeper and focus on the areas that we felt ourselves were prevalent. So, we decided on mining and energy, mining and resources, which includes METs, critical minerals, rare earths, etc. We went into advanced manufacturing, and advanced manufacturing includes technologically advanced manufacturing, high-end, whether it's, space or defense, whether it's, lithium-ion batteries, or any of those really technically advanced niche sectors that India could benefit from. We decided on healthcare. Healthcare looks at pharmaceuticals. Of course, India is very strong in the pharmaceutical sector, and also looked at biotechnology, which Australia is very strong in. So combining the R&D in biotechnology with the manufacturing and distribution of India. We decided on sports. Sports is good for us. We have Ravi Shastri on our board, as you know, and we also manage Alan Border. Our partners in India in sports are JSW Sports, and as you know, that they were instrumental in a lot of the medals that were won recently at the Olympics, particularly Neeraj Chopra, who's been guided by JSW Sports. They have an academy which trains boxers, wrestlers, athletes, and their goal was to work with the Indian government's goal, which is to win as many medals as possible in the Olympics, which they did a very good job. We do touch on agriculture as well, and I think that's an important sector, agribusiness. But we can get into the industry sectors a little bit better later. But we're just talking about how we are working from a business perspective, and what's changed is that we're just focused on very specific sectors that we believe, and our motto actually is Australia's strengths and India's aspirations. And we believe these are the sectors, these are the low-hanging fruits for both countries to work with.
Very fascinating. And I think when you spoke about, the sports angle to your career, I think that just took me back to my time playing cricket as well. So that was very wonderful hearing from you. Maybe we can chat about that after the podcast. Let's maybe just get into, the meat of the matter, right? So, there's been a lot of discussion in the India-Australia space, as both of you pointed out, and in fact, it kind of coincides a lot with the general perception towards Australia in the Indian government establishment. It's a very clear indication of a more action-oriented approach, and which is also reflected in Dipen's kind of work ethic as kind of a business leader there in Australia. So, what we can start off by talking about is really, the post-1991 phase, right? And India, just a couple of weeks back, I guess, celebrated 30 years of these very momentous reforms. So, often in foreign policy, what gets missed out is that, before interstate relations, occur, you actually have businesses going to a certain country, setting up their kind of operations, which then allows the government to then bring in their expertise, bring in their investments, etc. So what I wanted to understand from both of you, you can feel free to jump in, whoever wishes to, is who are some of the first movers in the Australian business space that wanted to bet on the Indian market, right? So that post 1991 phase is interesting, given the MNCs and businesses that wanted to look towards India. In fact, even the decade prior to that. So, are there some examples that you can maybe share with our listeners?
Sure. Look, I think 1991 liberalization of the Indian economy was certainly a momentous occasion for India. Opening up India was needed, right? Because it was falling behind. I do know that a number of Australian companies did enter India at that time. Companies like Telstra, companies like ANZ Bank, a number of the other banks. Unfortunately, the experiences were not too good at that time. I know that ANZ Bank had given back their license after a certain period of time. They owned Greenlays, which was the biggest foreign bank in India at that time, and I think they sold that off as well. And in the last few years, the last probably 7 or 8 years, they've received that license back again. So I think when you're looking at that, you've got to look at where Australia was as a country, what it was doing, who the leaders were, what were the makeup of the boards, the White Australia policy. All of those things were coming into play around that time, and even a decade before that, as you suggested. So, a lot of the companies that did go in there, Rio Tinto was there, and, they recently sold out their diamond mine as well. These are the companies that went in. They were early entrants into India, but they really didn't have the success that they were expecting. And I believe that they probably went in with some blinkers on, not really understanding the socioeconomics, the macro economics, the geographic, the environment, the political, and so on. I believe today, though, there is far more understanding, although it's very, very limited. And we're going through a lot of issues here in Australia. We're trying to align ourselves with our Asian neighbours. The government released, Australia in the Asian Century white paper a couple of years ago. Actively promoting trade with Japan, Korea, Indonesia. Obviously, with China, we've had a phenomenal relationship, $250 billion trade annually, and keeps growing, which is our number one trading partner. And so Australia has made some strides. I think the boards, there's a lot of push through organizations like AsiaLink, Asia Society, that are promoting more gender equality, but more cultural equality on Australian boards as well, to provide a better understanding. So I think there's been a major shift, but not a lot has been spoken about right now of the past experiences, and there's not much coverage of the past experiences. But if we look at the current scenario, the current geopolitical issues that are prevalent, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, I believe that Australia is really working, Australian government, Australian diplomats, Australian businesses are working very, very diligently and very hard to look at taking a lot of the eggs that they put into one basket and sharing the risk. And India is at one of the highest priorities. I think they want to have India in the top 3 priority lists at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So, Natasha, if I can turn to you, and as Dipen alluded, the relationship has been a mixed bag, since the 1991 reforms. But I think over the last 10 to 15 years, I think what Indian policymakers and Australian policymakers would observe is that there's been a strategic shift, and that strategic shift has been contributed by the China challenge, as most analysts have pointed out. And also maybe some of the policies, domestic policies in countries like the UK and the US, which have just turned more inward looking, if I may, as compared to Australia. And this has actually provided, the bedrock to the foundation of the India-Australia relationship, which is just going to accelerate over the years. But in some instances, the economic partnership has not realized its potential, right? So, and we will get to the trade talks and negotiations in a little later. But what do you think have historically been the roadblocks in the economic partnership between India and Australia? So, if you could just shed some light on that.
Okay. So just getting used to the mute and the unmute to remind myself. But going back to your question on historically what has worked or what has not worked in this relation, and picking from where Dipen has left. See, I would start with a disclaimer saying that. The historical, my historical understanding of the Australia-India bilateral ties might not be very exhaustive because I've only been here for 3 years and still picking up on that. But just to tell you about exactly what's come through is that in 1990, the first ever Senate committee report on Australia-India trade came out, and which very categorically stated that how Australia has neglected India. And that was one first clear recognition that India was not being given the kind of attention which was required. Now if we move back from there, then we have seen the Australia setting up of the Australia India Council in 1992, a lot of joint commissions, a lot of committees were formed between both countries. But there has always been a very low key political engagement between both countries. And for anything to happen, there has to be, a more sustained political momentum to a relationship for economic relationship to pick up. And that's something which I feel has been really lacking in this relationship. Now, you've asked me about the roadblocks historically, what has not really worked. And not happened, in terms of why the economic component of this relationship hasn't really picked up. And I would say political uncertainty, political instability in Australia, the revolving door prime minister, something which we have heard for long with so many prime ministers in a short tenure. So there was lack of policy certainty, there was lack of regional focus, that how countries will engage, and India was nowhere on a radar. In fact, former High Commissioner, Navdeep Suri had earlier written that seeing the current times, China has been that necessary catalyst for Australia-India bilateral ties, because there's now a desperate realization for Australia that they will need to diversify, they need to have more stability in their global supply chains, they need to get themselves more, secure themselves. So that's one policy, political uncertainty. Also, I would say from Indian perspective, and I would assume here there was lack of reciprocity, because even from the Indian side, our focus in India was on our neighborhood, on US. So Australia was again not on our radar, and that's been something which has been clearly stated earlier also. And again, a very antiquated understanding of India's growth story. This is something which even the Senate committee report mentions, that the media perception about India, and it's unfortunate it still remains the same. And that's where we as an organization is trying to build on that narrative, that how do we actually communicate this reality, that how India, which and the experience which Australian businesses have had in last several years. Things have moved, reforms are happening. Uh, from that perspective, there have been roadblocks. But Carl, if I take a step back and if I, try and understand even today what's not working in this relationship, why the economic component of this relationship still remains subdued. And Dipen can correct me, if I'm wrong here. And this I primarily say from the recent developments which we have noticed is, for instance, talking about people-to-people ties and the role of Indian IT-skilled migrants in Australian economy. But the hassles in issuing IT-skilled visas and the erratic policy surrounding it still remains. So there is an ambivalence which still is difficult to understand. So there's a disconnect between economic ambitions for the relationship and political articulation of it. Secondly, India has been credited as pharmacy of the world, the Indo-Pacific Vaccine Initiative, India emerging as a world's vaccine manufacturer, leading vaccine manufacturer. But when it comes to approving Covishield and Covaxin for returning citizens to Australia, it's not approved. So it leaves at least us confused that what's exactly is the Australian understanding of India's pharma might. Similarly, our education partnerships, a flagship sector between both countries, but we are still unaware of the strategies that are in place to bring back international students. Similarly, Australia can't be doing minor investment and expect itself to emerge as India favorite or a key trading partner. So the transactional outlook towards this relationship will continue to hinder any genuine growth in these ties. The focus, we personally believe, should be that if Australia can emerge as a development anchor, and this is something which we have repeatedly written in many of you know our papers as well. Australia would need to engage closely with India's changing development paradigm, a factor which I feel that is least understood and is marred by antiquated understanding. The politics and the economics of this relationship are interdependent, a realization that's deeply missed, in Australia today. And if this is the kind of messaging that continues to happen, then I feel that the economic ambitions of the relationship will continue to suffer, Carl.
Oh, absolutely. And I think in many ways, what you just pointed out is brilliantly captured in the Indian Economic Strategy Report authored by Mr. Peter Burgess. So my next question to you, Dipen, is actually related to the IES report 2035. And I think it really articulates what needs to be done on a war footing between both the countries. And at the same time, as Natasha pointed out, understanding India's new development paradigm, right? And the report has cited, numerous sectors which needs to be identified in the overall partnership. So, in your view, as an Australian, from an Australian perspective, which do you think are the sectors that Australian businesses can maybe, consider, in the Indian market with minimal, kind of regulatory challenges? Because that's important, looking at, the post-COVID world that we live in, and understandably, there will be a lot of domestic kind of policies, right, on that front. So what do you think are some of the key sectors that Australian businesses can look at?
So thanks, Carl. And let me just reiterate that I totally agree with what Natasha just said. And that is that, there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of talk, but the reality is that a lot of work needs to be done. And, it's important that, we can send the messaging through, whether it's through a minister or through, reports and so on. But if we don't action those messages, then they just wither away and die. So, if we're talking about the people-to-people connectivity, then let's really seriously dig deeper into that and see what can happen. We're talking about trade and investment relationships, and India is known globally to be the pharmacy manufacturer of the world. What can Australia benefit? I mean, we're going through issues, and I constantly watch the TV, and over the last few months, there's been a lot of talk by the Australian public about the fact that the Australian government did not order enough vaccines, right? And so they've started to, but why were they not talking to India? When India is the largest producer of vaccines in the world, and many countries have benefited from that. So there are a lot of question marks that need to be asked there. I've already mentioned to you earlier in my comments about the industry sectors that we feel are relevant and are low-hanging fruits. Again, Australia's strengths are in the mining, the mining equipment technology. There's an abundance of critical minerals and rare earths that Australia can offer. It's a secure country to work with. You don't have to worry about corruption, or you don't have to worry about supply chains. They're already developed, the ports, the shipping, the railroads, the governance behind getting approvals for mines, and so on. So that's one sector. I know that with India having a number of auctions now happening in India for mines, I believe a few of those auctions are being won by companies that have not had any experience in mining before. and they could do well to work with Australian companies who are willing to hold their hands and do the mining aspects and the technology aspects for them. We're talking to a number of Australian companies at the moment that are interested in doing so. We talked about Australia's strength in biotechnology. There's a number of companies that are developing incredible technology and IP. We're representing a couple of companies that have technology in prostate cancer, in many different other areas, breast cancer, and so on. Now, these are areas that Indian companies, Indian investors, Indian pharmaceutical companies should pick up on very quickly, because I believe that there is merit in not just looking at more funding in these areas, but also clinical trials could be held in India at a cheaper cost and a better rate. Beyond that, manufacturing, obviously, India is one of the best, if not the best, manufacturers of pharmaceuticals in the world. Most, if not all, of the top tier pharmaceutical manufacturers have TGA approval on their plants in India, so that alleviates the policy issue or the governance issue or the efficacy of the products, and also the distribution, the global distribution. So there's a really good match in those sectors. Also, as I said, Australia is very strong in sports. You look at how it achieved in the Olympics, a population of 27 million people, in the top 10 in the world in the medals in the Olympics. This doesn't come overnight. There is a lot of work that goes on at an entry level, from schools onto the Institute of Sports, onto elite training, etc., etc. So Australia can offer tremendous value to India, and you can see the excitement in the young Indians today about the different types of sports that they could actually participate in, not just cricket, right? And the professionalization of sports like badminton, hockey, basketball, soccer, football, swimming, tennis, kabaddi. These sports are now going to pay, and so youngsters who traditionally the parents want them to become doctors and engineers and professionals, now could have an opportunity and do have an opportunity to become a professional sports person. And so there's a lot in sports that Australia can offer India. Manufacturing, of course, to support the government's initiative in Make in India. I believe that India now has to shift a little bit. We've had some experience in manufacturing where manufacturers in India were very, very focused on manufacturing domestically. So now that the geopolitics and the new world, new supply chain initiatives are coming into fruition, Indian manufacturers will have to now start to think about how they can manufacture for the world. And it was only, I think it was last week, that Prime Minister Modi had a meeting with all of the missions globally, and the big message there was to look at exports. And exports can only come if you're manufacturing quality produce that is acceptable to the world. So Australia has very deep, very deep knowledge of technically advanced manufacturing in all sectors, not just space and defense, in all sectors. Agriculture and agribusiness, food processing are areas that are very, very good, where Australia really does. It used to be, we used to call Australia the food bowl of Asia, and it still is. There's an immense amount of agriculture in Australia, and so the technologies, the IP behind that is immense, and Australia can add a lot of value to that. I'm not a big, and I might be controversial here, but I'm not a big fan of the education chapter sort of sectors at the moment, because I believe that we really don't understand we as in Australia really doesn't understand India and what it needs. I did a lot of work when I was with AIBC on both higher education and vocational education skills development. And I believe that for skills development, Australian vocational education institutes actually have to go to India and train in the country. The export revenue that was generated by Australia from Indian students coming to Australia and studying in vocational education has diminished considerably. And that is because there are better and better opportunities to educate themselves in India. Higher education, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. I believe that we do very, very well with Indian students coming to Australia. But as Natasha pointed out, there needs to be a strategy on how we're going to get these students back to Australia as soon as possible. There's a lot of, we post a lot of social media posts on Twitter and LinkedIn, and particularly on Twitter, whenever we tend to post something that is, to do with Australia, India, we inevitably get a couple of comments from Indian students saying, please help us, please. So, there is a little bit of desperation there, and there is a little bit of thought that needs to go in from the Australian government. I believe the Australian universities do want the students back, but the government is holding back. And the sooner that happens, the better. I'll leave it at that. I think that's enough sectors for us to focus on. I'm sure there are other people that are out there that have skills in other sectors. If you look at the Australia-India Business Council, for example, they've launched, I think, 12 or 13 industry chapters nationally, which focus on other sectors too. So depending on which sector that you are actually really focused on would work for you in India right now.
Right. And thanks for that very interesting exposition of the different sectors that Australian businesses can look at, going forward. And we will kind of, take a deep dive into a few of them, in our conversation. So, Natasha, if I can maybe just, ask your thoughts on another report which was released, earlier last year, which is the Australian Economic Strategy, which was authored by Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. And you, in fact, very eloquently in that article that you had wrote, and we link all these references in our show notes of the program. And I quote, you said that this creates a perfect roadmap for future economic engagement between India and Australia. As also Dipen pointed out that, different industry chapters, national business chapters that have, that have come about in Australia. How do you think these actors, right, your business associations, your consulates, embassies, you even have new divisions within the MEA that's dedicated to economic diplomacy that can leverage a lot of the insights from these reports. How do you think their role is going to shape up in light of the India-Australia relationship? So a little bit on that.
So I think that's an excellent question, Carl. And the fact that AES, the Australia Economic Strategy, was released as a reciprocal report to Peter Vergis's India Economic Strategy report, last year in December. Categorically states that the Indian government, it shows Indian government's intent to engage with Australia and a greater ministerial and business engagement between both countries, if I may say that. And the fact that the AES is also the only strategy report ever produced by the Indian government for any specific country, something which I've also mentioned in my article. Now, you've asked me this question about how do I feel that the Indian consulates here in Australia and the diplomacy division of MEA can further engage with MEA. Well, again, I would go back to AES because it suggests a series of short, mid-term, and long-term recommendations for these engagement. It also says, facilitative recommendations that how the consulates here can be more proactive in engaging with the Australian big businesses, something which I feel still there's quite a bit to be done in this particular space, to engage the Australian businesses, the Business Council of Australia, along with the Australia-India Business Council, a more coordination mechanism through a consultative interministerial approach to rejuvenate or revive the CEO forum, something that existed and for last few years is gone inactive. So these are things which I would say that the Indian government can actually look into, that how all the institutional infrastructure, institutional mechanisms that are already in place, how can we actually more proactively utilize the strength of these institutions and create arrangements which leads to more sustained engagement between both sides, and more or less from the business side, because that's a very that's an area which continues to lack. Even for the involvement of the Indian chambers of commerce, the CII, how do we engage the big businesses which still feel that India is a very complex market, very difficult market to do business? So I would say more awareness and information also on sectoral reforms, because from our experience, we have realized that there's a very generic understanding of what sort of reforms have happened in the Indian market. We need to understand that all these reforms, be it the mining sector or the pharma sector, these reforms have a very specific nature. So if we can educate different businesses across different sectors how these sectoral reforms will really have an impact on their business, I think there can be a greater alignment. And let's not forget, Carl, here that most of these, and this I personally find very fascinating about Australia, that most of the Australian states have a dedicated India strategy, which shows the interest and their intent to engage with India. And many of these states also have a sister state relationship with Indian states. For New South Wales to have a sister state relationship with Gujarat, in fact, with Andhra Pradesh. Then there are many other states. Victoria also has, in fact, Dipen, in his role as AIBC chairman, has also played a key role for the sister state relationship between NSW and Gujarat. So there is a dedicated strategy by most of all these Australian states. I would say that from the Indian side, we would want to see more local champions to be promoting these ties, utilize the diaspora strongly, because most of these young people, or also people who have been here for last several years, they are your biggest champions. They know about particular sector, they have their network, they have their skills, they have that talent to take forward a particular sector's information and reach out to these businesses who are working in these different businesses. So I would say that the tremendous opportunities, tremendous potential, and there's also significant understanding. It's just that how do you action them, and how much time and energy you invest in actioning them.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that, Natasha. I think there was a slight lag in my video. Right. So Dipen, if I can, just turn to you and maybe explore this subject a little further in the context of the bilateral trade between India and Australia. And very recently, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott had made a visit to India with a delegation, met with the Prime Minister, and I think that the trade talks are going to move very, very quickly from this point on. But if I could just maybe highlight a DFAT, statistics, that I came across, which said that the two-way trade with India actually fell by almost 13%, and even exports falling around 20% in the year 2020. So as both these countries are beginning to enter, negotiations on the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, the CECA, to what extent do you think this will actually be a significant or play a significant difference to the bilateral economic relationship?
Thank you, Carl. Look, I think first and foremost, let me congratulate the government of Australia for appointing Tony Abbott as the special trade envoy to India, particularly to assist with the FTA negotiations. Natasha and I met with Mr. Abbott a few times. In fact, we had invited him to participate in one of our Australia-India conversations. So if you go to our website, you'll see a couple of conversations with Mr. Abbott and his thoughts and views on the Australia-India relationship. Mr. Abbott had some unfinished business in 2015. He had started the trade negotiations again. There were 6 or 7 visits by the then Trade Minister, Mr. Andrew Robb, to meet with Nirmala Sitharaman, who was the Trade Minister then. Unfortunately, things did not eventuate, so Mr. Abbott had a little bit of unfinished business. He also has an affiliation with India, which helps. And so we've got the right person who has India at heart, but also he realizes the potential between Australia and India. Now, when somebody of that caliber takes on a task of this magnitude, you need to wonder what's going on in his head. Mr. Abbott is a Rhodes Scholar. He's a super intelligent man, and he sees and has obviously seen a lot more than we have. And to have a former Prime Minister promote the Australia-India trade and investment ties, somebody who has a very good rapport with Prime Minister Modi, was, music to our ears. So congratulations to the Australian government. As Mr. Abbott has, quoted in some of his articles in the Australian, it's more than likely that the negotiations will look at early harvest deals, and that is a very, very strong possibility. They're looking at potentially 100 tariff lines that actually cover 98% of the trade in services and investments. I guess the investments can wait, but at least in services, they're going to cover about 98% of the trade that is currently taking part between India and Australia. I believe that with Mr. Abbott in the center there, he is quite, having dealt with him and continuously we talk to him on a regular basis, we know that he is actively involved. Not just at the front end, but at the back end too. Let me give you an example. I'm an independent director sitting on the board of Wollongong Coal, which the largest shareholder, and it's the largest investment by an Indian company in New South Wales. JSPL. Now JSPL have been waiting for approvals for some mining licenses to come to fruition in New South Wales. They've spent an exuberant amount of money in doing this. And, Mr. Abbott met with the chairman, Mr. Naveen Jindal, in Delhi, and promised to expedite this and speak to the minister. That's already happened. And Mr. Abbott is in quarantine. So, this is the speed at which Mr. Abbott is working. And I believe that there are a lot of other companies and people that are in contact with Mr. Abbott in regards to some of the issues that they've had. But look, can I make this point? In all the time that I've been focusing on the Australia-India relationship, and as Natasha has alluded to this earlier too, that Australia will have to work extremely hard for this relationship to work. Australia has to actually go and take a real big, deep dive into India, right? And it needs to understand, not just at the high level, the opportunities in the industry sectors, but as I said, at a micro level, the cities and the states that they're going to be working with, because each one of them has a different political view, a different environmental view, a different social view. And you actually need to treat each one of those states as a country in its own right. Although we have the likes of Niti Aayog that is promoting, the competitiveness between the states. What's the terminology I'm looking for, Natasha? Corporate, national, competitive corporate. Yes. So although the states are all competing against each other, for grants and assistance from the federal government, I think we need to take a much deeper dive and look at that in a much better way. Plus, Australia really has to look at more investments into India. We're in the top 5 countries in the world for savings, over $3 trillion, and some of that needs to be guided through to India. And India has taken some really good steps in the introduction of Invest India, NIIF, and NIIF has already attracted investments from Australia's largest super fund called Australian Super. I know that our sovereign fund, the Future Fund, is considering investments, but I think there needs to be a lot more. And that will then allow India to open up a bit. The biggest issue I have is the fact that now, in the old days, India was not reciprocating. India was not even giving a little bit of attention. We were not even in the top 20, priority countries for India. Today, as we are participating in things like, organizations like the Quad, like the Supply Chain Initiative with Japan, France, Australia, India. There's a number of initiatives that we're participating in with India, including, maritime security, areas as well. So I think that India has come to the party to an extent, but if you've got a country that is actively trying to court you and it's actively trying to look at ways and means of working with you and opening up new ways of doing business with you, then you actually have to realize that and come to the party as well. And I hope that India still doesn't have Australia on the back burners, but it brings it at least into the top 10 priority countries, because that's where it deserves to be. The geopolitics and the geoeconomics globally have changed. The new world is looking for partners, like-minded partners, the rule of law. When you look at the synergies between the two countries, the Westminster legal system, the English language, the connectivity through the Commonwealth, our love for sport, and particularly one sport, this is something that we really need to build on, and India needs to come to that party too. I'm not saying it needs to come full on, but at least show a little bit and then some, and open up a little bit more to Australia, because it hasn't done so far.
Yeah, agreed. I think this is, yeah, please, Natasha.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. So if I may add there to what Dipen has said about the CECA negotiations, the fact that it has taken us, in the last 8 years, 9 rounds of negotiations, and after, having a very detailed feasibility study, the political will, was lacking. From both sides, and for India to now revive these negotiations is also to quite an extent a response to their exit from the RCEP, because there's a clear-cut understanding that we will have to, make our exports more competitive. We'll have to integrate with the global supply chains, with the global value chains, and the only way to do that is with reviving and renegotiating the FTAs, which are already happening with other countries like the US. UK, the European Union, and now also Australia. I personally feel that this particular opportunity and the fact that Tony Abbott, who to his credit has actually signed FTAs with Asia's 3 biggest economies, in his tenure. Is something which is extremely credible, and also what fascinates us, and we've had these discussions internally about here is a prime minister who not in his official capacity but in his unofficial capacity is so involved in these bilateral ties, something which we have seen earlier prime ministers like Paul Keating being involved in the Australia-China relations. But here's a prime minister in his unofficial capacity very, very, very interested in the Australia-India bilateral ties, and that also tells about how we are headed, in building the economic component of this relationship, and to realize the AES as well as the IES targets, because something which categorically the IES says is to make India the 3rd largest export market and to increase the investment by 2035 to $100 billion. That can only be achieved if we have a dedicated deal to start with. And of course, I think an early harvest deal, as Dipen mentioned, is the best way forward to break this log jam, which has been hanging for quite some time, and to start with goods, and maybe services and investment can follow, in the next few months, but at least start somewhere. And I think it's a huge plus, as far as the economic relationship is concerned, Carl.
Right. So, in our last segment, what we'll do is we'll focus on 2 case studies in the India-Australia economic relationship. And I actually want to draw attention to our listeners to a very interesting case study of Australia's legume export business. right? And again, this is something which I came across during my research, which was quite fascinating to look at, which, in my opinion, kind of illustrates the structural impediments, for both the countries to enter into an economic kind of arrangement. And So if I can just, just point out a few, notes that I had taken out here. So in 2017, the legume export business was struck by a massive Indian import tariff, and it only gained a temporary reprieve last month. That this only for lentils, whereas a massive 60% levy on chickpeas, which also happens to be one of my favorite curries, the chana masala, continues to exist even today. So, so what's interesting here is that even in the WTO, India and Australia have kind of have had an ongoing dispute when it comes to the sugarcane, kind of producers, with India kind of allegedly kind of providing more protectionist measures to its domestic producers. So given that agribusiness has been cited as one of the key sectors in both the reports, what I wanted to understand, and any of you can jump in on this particular question, is how does India's domestic policy environment change to reflect this growing interest in sectors like agribusiness, and of course we have seen over the last 1 year the farm laws that have been introduced, which could play a pivotal role going forward. So what would be your take on how the policy environment in India needs to change to kind of absorb a lot of the advantages of the Australian industries?
Thanks, Carl. So look, first and foremost, when it comes to agriculture, we need to put right at the front end that India's import of legumes, lentils, chickpeas, predominantly is dependent on the monsoon season. If there is a good monsoon season, then India will not import these produce. It will be domestically grown. So India has enough capacity and is already producing enough legumes and lentils for consumption domestically. For Australia, as I said before, Australia is known as the food bowl of Asia, and so it does produce an ample amount of legumes, lentils, and chickpeas. And one of the biggest trades that I know, particularly, there are some farmers, farming groups in Queensland that were, selling chickpeas into India for a long time. That was some time ago. I'm not sure if that's still happening, but that was a consistent trade. But I've worked with a trader here in Sydney that was very focused on legumes and lentils. And they just didn't have much luck in selling into India. They were selling into Pakistan, into Sri Lanka, into Bangladesh, but very difficult to sell into India. So that's one thing. The other aspect I would suggest is the pricing. Australian produce is considered as some of the highest quality in the world. Australia farming systems, its resources, cost, raw materials, etc., is a little bit higher than other countries. It's an island, so we have to import a lot. We don't manufacture a lot, and so on. And so when it comes to selling Australian products, particularly in the agriculture sector, Japan, Korea, these are the countries in Asia that, Hong Kong, Singapore, these are the countries in Asia that buy a lot of Australian agricultural products. And so India tends to go for the cheaper end. And that is also prevalent if you look at our coal industry, if you look at our iron ore industry, our prices are much higher, not much higher, but a little bit higher than the likes of Indonesia and South Africa. So India tends to sort of look globally and find the best prices. And so there needs to be a little bit more of an adjustment from the Indian mentality that cheapest is not always the best. Natasha, have you got anything else to add for that?
No, thanks, Dipen, for that. I think you've largely covered everything. It's just that I feel that when we talk about agri business, it's a very sensitive sector, and the reason India is trying to protect this sector is primarily because we are looking at over 50% of our population, dependent on agriculture. So we'll have to understand, and even from the FTA perspective, I generally say that one needs to understand and draw very fine balance between economic gains versus domestic national interests, and any country would want to protect that, irrespective of be it Australia, India, UK, or US. Having said that, I think a good beginning, we've already seen in the last several years, there's been exports of wool, cotton, and leather. All that's already happening. But from an agribusiness perspective, I would say that we can focus more towards consulting, more towards technology which involves soil usage or water management, or areas where technicalities which are involved. How do you actually bring in more technical and expert knowledge which can help in increasing the productivity of India's agriculture sector, and that can actually be a more capacity building approach towards the agribusiness sector, rather than just looking at this market because you want to export a certain commodity. And that would be seen also in a positive light, I believe, from the Indian government side, because here we're trying to build your capacities, improve your productivity. It's been happening in the past, but I would tend to focus more on these areas rather than just looking at opportunities to export to the Indian market.
I would add something else here, and you mentioned Australian products going into India. All too often the Indian government has looked at the trade numbers between Australia and India, and they've very much favoured Australia. So Indian companies, the Indian government are looking at how they can export Indian produce into Australia. One prime example of that is Indian mangoes, and I know that we're looking at a few others. But in Australia, we have biosecurity, which is a government department, and AQUIS, which is Australian quarantine. Now, I'll give you a prime example. I was assisting one of Australia's largest poultry producers. And one of the things that obviously is required is stock feed for chicken. And one of the components of that, and the biggest component of that, is soya bean meal, which is high in protein. Australia was importing around 1 million tons a year from South America. Now, these were genetically modified soybeans. When I looked at India, India's produce was non-GMO, which is what the Australian consumers preferred. And so we looked at an exercise, and at that time we looked at Ruchi Soya and Adani Wilmar, and we had to then take AQUIS, Australian quarantine, and biosecurity to one of the farms where Ruchi Soya grew soybeans. They analyzed how they were grown. They analyzed how they harvested the beans. They analyzed how they would then crush the beans to produce the oil, the edible oil, plus the meal that comes from it. The meal then has to be warmed 2 or 3 times. You can't heat it too much because you burn away all the nutrients. So it has to be heated a couple of times. They looked at how the meal was stored. They looked at how the meal was transported by truck. They looked at how it was exposed to all of the different elements through that journey from storage through to the port. They looked at how the meal was then stored at port, how it was then taken out of the port and put into the ship, how it was stored in the ship, and how it traveled via ship. Fortunately, it was approved. Everything went really smoothly. Unfortunately, the price of soybean meal went up from $200 to $400, so it was not viable. But if we were to look and analyze in those kind of details and take a deeper dive in many different products that India produces, I have no doubt that India would be able to provide a lot of produce to Australia. Let me give you another example. Australia is an island, and Australia has a big seafood industry. A lot of farms are produced at sea. A lot of seafood is produced, but I'd say 90% of that seafood that is caught on Australian shores is exported, and Australia imports 80 to 90% of the produce of seafood that it eats and that is consumed by Australians because it's too expensive. The local produce is too expensive, so they export it and they import cheaper produce. Now, India has an opportunity there as well. And you look at prawns or shrimps, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of tons of prawns and shrimps are consumed every year by Australian consumers. So when we take a deeper dive into those areas, mangoes, I know that there was an issue with mangoes, with ripening them, and there were some insects in the shell, and we're looking at different ways of killing those insects through technology. It can be done because Australia produces mangoes, very good mangoes, at certain seasonal times, but out of season, India can assist with those mangoes. There's lots of other produces that Australia, but we need to take a deep dive into that.
Right. No, that's quite fascinating, and those insights would really be beneficial if looked at from the point of view of the trade deal that is being ironed out by both the countries. So let's keep our fingers crossed on that one. So the other sector, and maybe we can wrap up with this particular case study, is that of the e-commerce industry, and I'm sure both of you are aware that the e-grocery market is rapidly growing in India. And I think recently we had also witnessed Legos, which is part of Simplet Australia's iconic food brand, recently launching its products, Italian range of products, including sauces and pasta in the Indian market. So this, I think, again, in many ways opens opportunities for the India-Australia kind of business-to-business ties. So what would be your kind of strategic advice to Australian businesses sectors in the e-commerce industry, and more specifically the e-grocery, which at this point of time is still just 1 to 3%, of the total market. So, given the huge market potential there, what would be your advice as an organization, as very keen observers of this space?
Well, let me start off. So, I think let me also at the outset congratulate Austrade, the Australian Trade Commission, and the people that work on the ground in India. They've done a fabulous job in promoting e-commerce and taking and holding the hands of some very good Australian brands, and making sure that they have the platform and the reach, and to partner with Amazon India to have a special area just for Australian produce is excellent. Legos, sauce and pasta. Buying pasta and sauce from an Australian company rather than an Italian company baffles me, but the quality of the food that is produced in Australia is second to none. And this is why it's happening. And so we can take examples of many, many different sort of brands in Australia. When you look at Australian, I assisted at a very, very long time ago. Arnott's produced Tim Tams, which is the Australian biscuit, right? The chocolate biscuits. Now, as I said to you before, Australian products for your average everyday Indian consumer are expensive. So when you're looking at biscuits, there's a mentality that I buy, specific biscuits from India that cost me 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 rupees. And then when you're coming to look at Australian biscuits like Tim Tams, your prices go up to 700 rupees or 1,000 rupees or something of that nature, which there's a large disparity. But Tim Tams are also manufactured in Indonesia, where the chocolate is cheaper and the raw materials are cheaper. So you can actually ship them at a cheaper price from another country, right? So that's what's happening now. There's some Tim Tams that are sitting on shelves in India, and that's what's happening. So we assisted in finding a distributor for Arnott's a long time ago. So I think that when you look at somebody like Blackmores who have just entered India, they're a vitamins, minerals company. Their products, again, are expensive for Indian consumers, but they can go to tier 1 cities and possibly tier 2 cities and work their way through. And I'm sure they'll be very, very successful with a good strategy. An e-commerce strategy, if they were to sit on that platform that Austrade has assisted in producing and putting together, I think they will have a lot of success. Branding is very important, right? In any company. So you'd have to spend a lot of marketing dollars. And our advice is e-commerce gives you a platform, but you're competing against everyone. So how do you get seen? And I believe Australia and Australian produce is very much on quality and not price. And so, the Indian consumer who's, very concerned about their health and the product and the raw materials that go into the products that are produced would want to see Australian products and want to use Australian products because of quality. But they have to be marketed as such in India. And they have to take that and they have to hold that sort of platform on an ongoing basis. Because Australia will never be able to produce the volumes that are required by India. So you have to then put yourself into the area of, okay, well, we're producing niche products for a niche market. And if you take Bombay, if you take Delhi, both have populations of 19, 20, 22 million people. Australia as a whole has 27 million people. And so they're comparable to cities. And so it's not a bad idea to actually think about, putting yourself into a mentality that we will produce high quality, high grade product, and we will charge accordingly. But of course, we have to not charge Australian prices, but Indian prices. And that will also give you the right margins that you're looking for, because as a business, you want to make profits. You just don't want to give your product away. And so that's important to make sure that you think that way and you then promote your brand accordingly.
Just adding to what Dipen has said, in terms of the e-commerce potential. Now, especially during the COVID time, we know that e-commerce has emerged as a very, big enabler. And from the perspective of Australian brands, the fact that, last year, when for the first time Amazon Australia store was launched by the former Trade Minister Simon Birmingham as part of the Australia-India Business Exchange. It was actually a huge hit, and that can be understood from the fact that it started with 12 brands, and currently I'm told that it has around 40 Australian brands ranging across beauty products, nutraceuticals, food, beverages. The international nature of products and the fact that there's a case in India where the young aspirational India wants to try these brands is a huge is a huge market in itself. In terms of the message to these new players who want to enter the e-commerce section, I think, as Dipen has already mentioned, there's to understand the e-commerce market of India, to understand this ecosystem more properly, the nature of your consumer, who you want to address, and also have a better sense of the compliance and the licensing requirements of these products. Where you need to go for these products. So for beauty, you would need to go to Cedesco, or for food, you would need to go to the food safety and security standards. So that ecosystem understanding is extremely important for the e-commerce players. And let's not forget, the MasterChef Australia is the highest viewership for MasterChef Australia actually comes from India. So we already have a very, very strong fan following for these international brands. It's just that how do we, bring more brands into the Australian store?
I think that's a very great example that you kind of cited there of the MasterChef Australia, and I think we are only at the tip of the iceberg in terms of how both countries can take advantage of the growing potential in both these respective markets. So maybe we can maybe end on this question on uh, how the diaspora can perhaps play a very crucial role. And I think in earlier on in the conversation, you alluded to how people-to-people ties needs to be furthered. In fact, it has in many ways been right at the front end of the India-Australia relationship. So, what would be your kind of view on the role of diasporas in the India-Australia partnership going forward? We can have both of your thoughts on that.
Why don't you start, Natasha?
Thanks, Dipen. Dipen has been a big champion of diaspora diplomacy. He has written quite a bit on that, and also in his presentations to the consulate and the High Commission earlier. But I would say, from my understanding and being part of this diaspora for last 3 years, I think there's tremendous potential. And let's not forget, diaspora is actually a microcosm of what India stands for. So we have 28 states, and you have, 700,000 population Indian diaspora in Australia, and they all bring different set of skills, talent, knowledge, culture. Because cultural understanding is key to doing business in India. It's a very diverse, complex market, and most of the time, that understanding is lacking. So, how do you really bridge that stronger cultural understanding? How you bring in what you need to do in Gujarat? How is Gujarat different from Maharashtra? Or how is Gujarat different from Madhya Pradesh, Bihar? Ask someone who has spent the first 20, 25, 30 years in that state, and take their insights, utilize them. And the power of the diaspora and their knowledge and their capacity to globalize these agendas. Globalize the economic reforms that are happening in India, to communicate it, to be our biggest advocates, be the biggest development advocates of India in Australia. That's somewhere I feel is still missing currently. We call them a living bridge, but there's still much needs to be done from both ends in realizing the true potential of the diaspora. Dipen, you want to add on that?
So yeah, look, I think the Indian diaspora in Australia is still young. When you compare the diaspora to the UK and the US, we're still quite young. But that sets the tone, right? Because I've been here for 32 years, and there are people that have been here longer than I. And if you look at those people, and they have assimilated, like I have, into the Australian ecosystem, the Australian sort of way of life, understanding Australia much, much deeper. And we're settled, and we're set in our ways. When you look at the new diaspora, and Indians are the largest number of migrants that were migrating to Australia over the last 4 or 5 years. When you look at going to a new country, you need to settle in, you need to find a job. If you're a student, you need to study. You might get married, you might have some children. And typical Indians would want to buy their property, then they want to pay that off straight away. There's no debt, right? And so there's a journey that each of the diaspora has to go through. And so I believe that the smaller number of the diaspora came in early, and they've assimilated. Their children are very Australianized. They barely speak any of the Indian languages. They barely, cook any of the Indian food. And they would prefer to be more Australian than Indian. That's a very small percentage. The ones that came in after, and then the ones that are coming in now, they're very focused on setting their life here. They're very focused on, creating, an affable and a good life. There are people like myself and Natasha and many, many others that are very, very passionate about India and Australia, and particularly India. Many of us, right? It's not just some of us, but there's many of us here. So we are the ones that are, pushing the India-Australia journey forward. We can see how India has grown and how India has evolved. And I must say, since Prime Minister Modi has taken on the role of Prime Minister, him visiting all of these different countries and creating, bilateral ties and multilateral ties, and you could see the kind of reception that he received in the countries that he visited, UK, US, Australia. You could see the passion that the Indian diaspora have in those countries towards India. I, for one, have become a lot prouder and a lot more boisterous to be Indian. It's given us more confidence that the stronger that India grows, the stronger we grow, and the more sort of voice that we have. And so the diaspora is definitely moving forward, and I think that we need to learn from the lessons from the US and UK on how to utilize the diaspora to get closer to India, how to utilize that people-to-people connectivity and that living bridge to get closer to India, and how to really take a deep dive. And that is really, really important across all aspects of what the government needs to do, the Australian government needs to do here. There are a lot of people that just sort of take it for granted. And I don't think that the diaspora can be taken for granted. I think it needs to be treated with a lot more seriousness because there are a lot of people that are just getting on with their lives here that needs to be sort of attracted to this relationship that can actually add value, if that makes any sense. So I think that again, going back, the diaspora is young and it's still got a long way to go to catch up to where they are in the UK and US. They're getting there. They're really getting themselves into business, into academia, into politics. We see quite a bit of politicians now coming through, sports, and so they're making their mark. And they're hard workers. If you look at the UK. It is said that the UK is really run off the back of the hard work of the NRIs. Outside of the North Sea oil, it's really much the NRIs. So we know that Indians work hard. They add value. They are the highest taxpayers in Australia, and so you can see that momentum building. I think we have another 5 or 10 years to go, and I think that will be accelerated because of the pandemic. And you'll see a different diaspora. You'll see a more confident, a more agile, and more proactive diaspora when it comes to India and Australia.
Yeah, and these wonderful insights, for the benefit of our listeners, is actually captured really well in this article by Dipen, which we link to the show notes. And in fact, I just want to end by picking a line out from this article where you aptly describe the Australia-India relationship as revolving around the 3 C's of cricket, curry, and the Commonwealth. I think that's a great kind of way to look at the relationship. And clearly, I think the effort moving forward, is to include a 4th C, if I may, which is just that of the commerce. So, hoping that both the countries can, in many ways see this through will be something which all of us can look forward to. But on that note, Dipen, Natasha, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was an absolute pleasure for me personally to host you and understand, the different challenges in this landscape and get a business perspective, which, in my view, often gets missed out in foreign policy discussions. So that was very enlightening. So I hope you enjoyed, this conversation as much as I did. And thanks so much.
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate you bringing us on, and it was a wonderful experience. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Carl. It was a great, it was indeed a great opportunity to, hear those very, very insightful questions from you, because the kind of, work which you have done in terms of really doing a deep dive in this bilateral ties and asking us those questions, which I would have imagined to be asked by somebody who's been in this space for some time. So I wish to congratulate you, the kind of hard work you have put in into raising those very important questions.
Thanks so much.
I agree. Your research was impeccable. Well done. Just on that cricket, Curry and Commonwealth, we have changed the narrative. There's a lot of people in Australia that have been working in this sector for a while that feel that it's old and outdated and we need to change it. I believe that cricket is underutilized. We need to utilize a lot more of the cricket connectivity we have, and in a big way, because that is a common connector where we can talk to each other about cricket, and then that can lead to other aspects of business and trade and friendship, right? That's important. I think Curry and Commonwealth are a little bit outdated now. Commerce is definitely something that we need to focus on, you're right. But well done on the research that you've done and reading all of our articles. I didn't know that they were being read and regurgitated. Well done. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thanks so much. We